A flight attendant disrespected a black CEO's baby, but the father quickly took control of the situation, and the entire cabin watched as justice unfolded. A flight attendant grabbed the black CEO's baby by the leg, thinking no one would stop him. He didn't realize the father was ready to act, and his response would shake the entire cabin. Subscribe if you believe arrogance always collapses when real protection rises. Rendrick Vale's eyes didn't move as Marcel stepped through the cabin doorway. They were already fixed, staring, unblinking like a scanner trained to lock onto a target. Not the kind of stare a flight attendant offered with polite detachment. No, this was different. Intentional. Observational. Marcel noticed it even if he didn't flinch. The moment his polished shoes crossed into the first-class section of Air Flight 622, he felt the air change, not from turbulence, but from something colder, measured. He adjusted the weight of the 10-month-old sleeping against his shoulder, instinctively securing the soft blanket that had drifted down Lien's back. The boy didn't stir. Even amid the metallic chime of overhead bins being shut and passengers settling in, Lien's slow, rhythmic breathing stayed constant. But Marcel's grip tightened around the infant's lower back, a gesture that came not from fear, but preparation. There was something in the stillness of the crew members up ahead that struck him as unnatural. The wiry man stepped forward first. "Boarding pass?" he asked with a faint, rehearsed smile. His voice was smooth but distant, like someone reading lines he didn't believe in. The badge clipped to his uniform read Rendrick Vale. Marcel handed the pass over without a word. Rendrick studied it longer than necessary. "Seat 1A," he murmured at last, then looked up and stared again, not at Marcel this time, but at the bundled child in his arms. His eyes flicked back and forth between the pass and the child, as if trying to reconcile something in his mind. Then he nodded slowly and gestured down the aisle. "Right this way." Marcel gave a small, cordial nod and moved forward, carrying Lien as if he were a precious extension of his own body. Behind him, the second attendant, slightly younger, with a clean-shaven face and sharp jawline, muttered something low. Rendrick didn't reply aloud, but Marcel caught the way the corners of his mouth tightened. It wasn't new to Marcel. Suspicion had followed him before. A well-dressed black man in first class, alone with an infant. Some always stared, some whispered. Most let it go. But this felt different. It wasn't doubt. It was intent. He slid into 1A, placing his black briefcase carefully beneath the seat. Inside it, secured behind biometric encryption, was a sealed data tablet, a delivery that had to reach the Velmora Consortium by midnight. The information it contained wasn't just sensitive. It was volatile. His team at Verones Dynamics had spent the last 18 months perfecting the AI security logic embedded within. Ethics-coded response trees, real-time threat calibration, autonomous override balancing, capabilities that could shift global crisis response standards. And it all sat in that one sealed tablet. But none of that mattered more than Lien. Marcel glanced down at his son, still asleep, breathing evenly. A soft exhale warmed the edge of Marcel's shirt collar. He rested one palm lightly on the boy's back, listening to the engine hum through the fuselage. Passengers behind him finished boarding. The door sealed. The jet began to roll. Rendrick walked past again, slower this time, his body too stiff for a simple aisle check. His head tilted slightly as he passed Marcel's row, eyes locked for a second too long on Lien's head before he moved on. From the front galley, the other attendant, badge red Karen Dale, cast a glance toward Rendrick, frowning. Marcel caught it in the reflection of the cabin window. Karen looked unsettled, maybe even uncertain. Something passed between them. Not words, but weight. The plane lifted off. For a while, everything was quiet, calm. Marcel kept Lien nestled against his chest, adjusting the infant harness to let the child rest comfortably. The lights dimmed overhead. A warm amber hue lit the ceiling panels. The cabin settled into its cruising rhythm. Drinks were served. A few passengers reclined. But Rendrick lingered near the galley door, unmoving, arms folded across his chest. Marcel tried to relax, but instinct pushed back. He had faced contract assassins disguised as negotiators during a deal in Vermont. He'd escaped a fake car crash cover attempt when Veroni's Dynamics was being poached by overseas investors. His reflex for danger didn't just whisper, it alerted with precision. And something here felt scripted, pre-written. Across the aisle, Karen passed Marcel without eye contact. But just before he disappeared behind the curtain, Marcel caught his expression, anxiety bleeding through practiced professionalism. Then came the whisper. Rendrick leaned against the galley wall and muttered just loud enough for the quiet hum not to hide it. Some passengers don't qualify for first-class safety measures. Marcel turned his head slightly, not in confrontation, but in confirmation. He had heard it, clearly. He didn't react right away. His mind worked through the layers. Not anger, strategy. Not surprise, assessment. Who says something like that without a reason? He checked the tablet beneath his seat again, verifying the biometric lock with a subtle pressure of his heel. Secure. Then he shifted in his seat, brushing a hand across Lien's blanket again. Something was wrong. Something had already begun. And Marcel realized, this wasn't about suspicion. This wasn't about first-class etiquette or infant policy. This was about placement, timing, precision, control. Because from the moment he stepped onto Flight 622, the eyes watching him weren't just judging. They were waiting for a signal, a moment, a trigger. And when that moment came, it wouldn't start with noise or a sudden fight. It would start with something quiet, something subtle, something designed to feel like policy. And then it would take everything from there. Something on this flight was already watching him. Marcel didn't flinch when the flight attendant's hand hovered closer to his son. "I'll need to hold the infant for a moment while we check the seat restraints," the wiry man said, voice taut, eyes flat with authority that didn't belong. His name tag read Rendrick Vale, and the request had come with neither warmth nor context, just force, cloaked in formality. Marcel's grip on Lien tightened. The baby stirred but didn't cry, still wrapped snugly against his father's chest. "That won't be necessary," Marcel said calmly, his voice composed but direct, the kind that didn't welcome negotiation. A beat of silence passed. Rendrick didn't move away. He remained unervingly close, shoulders squared, gaze unmoving. It was the way soldiers once stared across fences, not with curiosity, but with calculation. Behind him, the quiet cabin hummed with the familiar drone of ascent, soft lights casting a mellow amber over first class. Most passengers were already settling in, unaware of the subtle standoff playing out in the front row. From the galley, the second attendant, Karen Dale, stood half-hidden behind the service panel, arms loosely folded, eyes flicking between Marcel and Rendrick, his brow furrowed deeper each second. He looked less like a man aligned with a plan, and more like one discovering he had unknowingly stepped into its middle. Marcel noticed it all. "You're within regulation distance," he said evenly to Rendrick. "You've confirmed visual on the infant restraint. No need to interfere further." But Rendrick didn't back off. Instead, he leaned closer, invading Marcel's space with deliberate menace, and whispered, "Some passengers don't qualify for first-class safety measures." The words landed cold. Measured, practiced. Marcel's jaw tightened, but he didn't react. He had endured boardroom ambushes, legal traps, hostile investors who smiled before they struck. This was the same energy, only with worse manners and less polish. He adjusted his body slightly, angling his shoulder to shield Lien more fully, while keeping his other hand near the briefcase tucked beneath the seat. The movement was instinctive, a trained kind of caution born from experience with high-stakes materials. Rendrick finally straightened, his smile rigid, almost satisfied, and turned away without another word. But he didn't go far, just 2 steps down the aisle, where he stopped and began to adjust an overhead bin that had no reason to be disturbed. His eyes, however, remained on Marcel, visible through the reflective glass of the cabin window. The message was clear. This wasn't about safety checks. It wasn't about seatbelts. It was about something else. Marcel's mind clicked into motion. He replayed the boarding sequence, the extra glance at his pass, the prolonged pause before Rendrick gestured to his seat, the faint nod exchanged with Karen Dale. Those weren't idle actions. They were cues, steps in a sequence. And he was the subject. He scanned the cabin with subtlety. The man in 1C had his eyes closed. The gentleman in 2A was reading. No one seemed aware. Only Karen kept glancing over now, his expression growing more uneasy by the second. The dramatic irony was no longer subtle. It was sharpening. Karen moved forward, hesitated, then offered Marcel a bottle of water. His hand trembled slightly as he passed it over. "Let me know if you need anything else, sir," he said, barely above a whisper. Marcel accepted the bottle without breaking eye contact. "Is everything in order, Mr. Dale?" Karen opened his mouth, then closed it. His lips thinned. "It's not what I thought it would be." A confession buried in small talk. A signal from someone trapped in a position he didn't control. Marcel gave a slight nod, enough to acknowledge but not draw attention. His instincts told him the conversation was being watched, possibly recorded. He needed to let Karen speak on his own terms at the right moment. Rendrick moved again, adjusting a curtain between first class and the rest of the cabin. He clipped it shut without asking. It reduced the line of sight from economy to nothing. A physical barrier. Another layer of isolation. Then he turned around, eyes locking with Marcel's across the cabin, and smiled faintly. Not friendly, not even polite. It was the smile of someone checking off steps. Marcel's pulse didn't rise, but his mind sharpened. The sealed data tablet under his seat, intended only for the Velmora Consortium, contained far more than predictive code. It housed the ethical override framework for a security AI system that could interrupt command protocols in live environments. Its activation thresholds alone were worth millions in licensing rights, and its misuse could dismantle reputations or entire companies. He hadn't made that public. Barely a dozen people knew it existed. Fewer knew its delivery schedule. So why was a flight attendant inching toward aggression the moment he boarded with it? And why target his child? He felt Lien shift slightly and brushed a hand over the infant's blanket, grounding himself. He would not allow harm to reach his son. Not physically, not emotionally, not symbolically. Not for data, not for profit. From the galley, Karen Dale returned again, but this time he paused halfway. He looked like he wanted to say something. His mouth parted, but Rendrick appeared behind him and said smoothly, "Karen, inventory check in back galley. Now." The tone was a command, not a request. Karen obeyed without argument, eyes briefly flicking to Marcel. And in that half-second, a message passed between them. One of regret, one of warning. Marcel sat still, spine straight, eyes forward. What they didn't know was that the man in 1A wasn't just an executive. He had once spent 6 years in field strategy roles before becoming a systems architect. He knew how to read steps, read people, read pressure. He didn't panic. He prepared. He had already shifted his phone onto a silent audio record mode. Already keyed his tablet's proximity alert in case it was moved. Already mapped every possible reaction route in case someone tried again. And someone would try again. Because this wasn't about flight protocol. This was about control. And as Marcel adjusted the angle of Lien's blanket to shield him from view, his thoughts settled into a razor edge. He no longer saw this as a disruption. He saw it as an operation, a test, and he would pass it. The crew moved as if following steps written long before he boarded. Rendrick lunged without warning. The motion cut through the dimmed cabin lights like a sudden tear in calm air. 1 second he was standing near the galley with forced composure. The next, his arm shot forward and his hand clamped around Lien's tiny leg. The grip was not gentle, not cautious, not the touch of anyone concerned with safety. It was sharp, forceful, and deliberate. Marcel reacted before sound could even escape his throat. His eyes widened. His heart stopped for a fraction of a second, and then instinct roared to life. He pulled Lien upward, securing the infant's torso with a firm, protective clasp. The child's small body jerked from the shock, and a fragile cry broke the silence. But Rendrick held on, his knuckles turning pale. His jaw clenched with an intensity that had nothing to do with procedure. "Let go of him," Marcel said, voice low and steady. Yet beneath that steadiness was a rising fire, raw fear covered by trained control. Rendrick didn't release him. Instead, he tightened his grip and lifted Lien slightly into the air, the infant's leg trembling under the pressure. The curtains around the first-class section muffled the gasps of passengers, but they didn't hide the shifting silhouettes. Several figures had risen from their seats, phones raised, watching with stunned disbelief. Karen stood frozen beside the galley counter, confusion and regret flickering across his face. His voice cracked as he whispered, barely audible, "Rendrick, this isn't right." Rendrick did not even glance at him. His eyes were fixed on Marcel with an intensity that bordered on hostile certainty, as though he was following a script only he understood. Marcel's mind sharpened instantly. His objective shifted from logic to survival, from mission to fatherhood. He anchored Lien's torso against his own chest with his left hand, keeping the infant safe, while his other arm braced against the armrest. Fear surged, but it did not paralyze him. It steadied him. With a swift, practiced motion, Marcel lifted Rendrick's wrist upward. The movement was precise, using leverage rather than brute strength. The angle forced Rendrick off balance, his shoes scraping against the carpet as his shoulder jerked backward. Karen flinched as the sudden shift broke the grip on Lien's leg. Marcel reinforced his stance and pulled harder. Rendrick's feet left the ground for the briefest moment, a controlled lift, just enough to knock him off center, and then gravity finished the job. His body collided with the galley wall in a loud, jarring crash that echoed through the cabin. Gasps burst from behind the partially closed curtains. One passenger whispered, "He grabbed the baby. He really grabbed him," disbelief coloring every word. Another held his phone higher, recording with trembling hands. Rendrick slid down the wall before pushing himself upright again, eyes narrowing, breath sharp and uneven. The impact should have rattled him into hesitation, but instead it sparked something colder. His expression hardened, revealing a dangerous mix of frustration and determination. Marcel stepped back, cradling Lien tightly. The infant cried against his chest, the small sound cutting through the tension like a fragile thread. Marcel angled his body to shield him, scanning Rendrick's posture. There was no remorse, no shock, only controlled fury, as though the attack had not been emotional but mechanical. Karen finally moved, stepping between them with shaking hands. "Rendrick, stop," he pleaded. "This isn't what you said would happen." The words hit the air like a stranded truth, but they only made Rendrick stiffen. He shot Karen a glare so sharp it silenced him instantly. Karen's shoulders slumped, his eyes falling to the floor, guilt beginning to claw its way through him. Marcel watched all of this in silence, every breath measured. His thoughts ran fast. Why had Rendrick acted with such confidence? Why target Lien? Why create a scene that endangered everyone? The pieces didn't fit, but the pattern was forming. The atmosphere shifted. Hidden motives moved beneath the surface like unseen currents. Passengers whispered nervously. The curtains trembled as more phones appeared through small gaps. Someone muttered, "Record everything," and another replied, "I already am." Marcel's pulse remained steady despite the pounding in his chest. He held Lien close, soothing him with soft movements, keeping one eye locked on Rendrick. What had begun as quiet unease had exploded into a confrontation that could not be undone. Rendrick straightened fully now, rubbing the back of his head from the impact. His lips curled into a restrained, calculated expression, not anger, but something practiced, like a man who believed he still had control. Marcel recognized that look. It wasn't the look of a man who acted in panic. It was the look of someone following instructions. And as that realization settled in, the weight of the moment shifted. Everything from the closed curtains to the whispered exchanges had been steps toward something larger, something deeply wrong. Passengers remained silent, waiting, breath held, fingers trembling over record buttons. Marcel tightened his grip on Lien, keeping himself between his child and the threat before him. The mission he boarded with, deliver the sealed data safely, now felt like a distant echo beneath a far more personal battle. The stakes had changed. The danger had become real, and the curtain between order and chaos had finally fallen. The moment Rendrick hit the galley wall, everything hidden came rushing into the open. Rendrick Vale slammed into the galley wall with a heavy thud, the metal surface reverberating faintly from the impact. The overhead lights flickered slightly from the shift in cabin pressure, but Rendrick was already pushing himself upright with startling speed, his eyes blazing, not with pain, but with a chilling, calculated focus. He rose slowly, straightening his uniform as if brushing off more than just the dust, brushing off defiance itself. There was no confusion in his glare. No sok, just something cold, rehearsed, like this was the moment he had been waiting for. Across from him, Marcel Veron stepped back with precision, his stance instinctive, refined by years of training that had nothing to do with business and everything to do with survival. Lien whimpered against his chest, the baby's fear pressing like heat into Marcel's ribs. He adjusted his grip on his son, left arm tight, hand cupping the infant's back, body tilted slightly to shield him from any further threat. The hum of the aircraft faded into a strange, hollow silence as tension filled the vacuum left behind. Karen Dale moved cautiously between them, his face pale and his lips parted in disbelief. His hands hovered at his sides, useless and trembling. Rendrick, stop, he pleaded, voice cracking under the strain of fear and guilt. This isn't what they ordered. Marcel's eyes locked onto that word. Ordered, not advised, not requested. Ordered. His mind processed it with mechanical speed, an external directive, a chain of command. This wasn't Rendrick improvising. This was execution, plan, command, a structure with layers above the man now rising in front of him. Endangering a child, Rendrick barked, loud and sharp. His voice carried with deliberate force, aiming for the ears behind the curtain. You witnessed it. He resisted protocol. He struck crew personnel. He pointed at Marcel with a theatrical flourish, forcing the scene into a narrative that would benefit him. But the desperation showed at the edges, leaking from his too perfect words. Marcel didn't speak. He didn't need to. 3 phones were still up, their lenses steady. The passengers behind the partially drawn curtain had seen everything, and the footage would say far more than any lie Rendrick could conjure. Marcel's focus never left the space between himself and the attendant. His breathing remained slow, strategic, controlled. His internal voice whispered what his expression would never reveal. This is a setup, and I'm not playing their script. Karen shifted closer, stepping again into Rendrick's path, but it was a mistake. With a sudden burst of energy, Rendrick shoved him aside. Not viciously, but with enough force to make it clear. This wasn't an act. This was intent. Karen stumbled into the service wall, catching himself against a supply drawer, his face contorting in a mixture of shame and dawning dread. He wasn't supposed to resist, Rendrick muttered, just loud enough for Marcel to hear. There it was, the crack in the surface. The plan had assumed compliance, fear, collapse, but Marcel hadn't done any of that. He had remained upright, steady, and worst of all, for the people behind this, aware. Marcel stepped sideways into the aisle with exactness, keeping himself between Rendrick and any path toward Lien. He positioned his legs with a slight shift in weight, his eyes sweeping the enclosed space. The curtains remained mostly drawn. The vantage points were narrow. It was all designed to minimize visibility, to contain the story, the witnesses, the fallout. But it was too late for that now. Karen's breath returned in shallow bursts. This wasn't supposed to be violent, he whispered. The request was for separation only. That word hit Marcel like a cipher. Separation. Not removal. Not protection. Separation. Cold. Clinical. It implied deliberate intent, dividing a father from his child under the guise of procedure. His mind raced. Why Lien? Why now? Before the thought could complete, Rendrick took a single step toward the rear bulkhead and reached. His hand moved toward the small silver latch just beside the service door. It was subtle, practiced, but Marcel understood the implications instantly. That latch wasn't meant to open the door. Not at altitude. Pressing it would trigger a sensor, a signal to the cockpit that the door had been tampered with. It would justify an emergency report. It would justify restraints. It would justify removal. The trap wasn't ending. It was evolving. No! Karen shouted, lunging forward with a burst of courage. Rendrick, don't! The fear in his voice pierced the tension like a blade. It was raw, real. Marcel didn't wait for confirmation. He advanced a single step, his voice low but sharpened by steel. Step away from that door. Rendrick's fingers hovered, twitching. This ends now, Marcel said, his tone flat, his body squared. He didn't yell. He didn't plead. He commanded. Rendrick turned slowly, a cruel half-smile tugging at his lips. But there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. Marcel had turned the situation inside out. The cameras, the bystanders, Karen's breakdown. The child still cradled safely in his arms. It all formed a portrait that no lie could overwrite. Behind Marcel, the curtain twitched again. More passengers stirred. More witnesses began to step out. The trap had sprung, but its prey was not the man holding the child. It was the man reaching for the door. The real danger had only started revealing its edges. Rendrick's hand hovered near the silver latch of the service door, just inches from triggering the prelock sensor. The faint buzz of the aircraft's overhead systems hummed like static in the air. But all Marcel could focus on was the dangerous stillness in Rendrick's expression. That wasn't the look of a crew member performing standard procedure. It was the look of a man about to execute the next step in a script already written. Marcel's eyes narrowed, calculating fast. He knew aviation protocol. That latch didn't have to be pulled fully open, just jostled hard enough to signal a system alert. And once that alert pinged the cockpit, Rendrick would have every excuse to cry interference and initiate a restraint under safety protocols. A setup, a trap dressed in regulation. Karen, who had been frozen in place until now, suddenly surged forward and gripped Rendrick's forearm. His voice cracked, loud enough to break the tense silence. You said the father would panic, he didn't. You said this wouldn't escalate. There was panic in his tone now, but more than that, remorse. Marcel didn't turn his head, but he registered it all. The trembling, the guilt, the betrayal bubbling to the surface too late to reverse the momentum. Positioning himself between Rendrick and the galley door, Marcel stepped sideways, not with force, but with strategic precision. Lien whimpered in his chest, feeling the tension spike. Marcel tightened his hold on the infant, shifting his weight slightly forward, placing himself at an angle where he could see both attendants without obstructing his field of movement. His heart rate remained steady, not from lack of fear, but from years of conditioning. Crisis didn't rattle him, it activated him. Behind the drawn privacy curtains, the muffled stirrings of passengers became louder, whispering, shifting, recording, the quiet chorus of phones capturing what the attendants had hoped to hide. A man's voice sliced through the tense air. We saw everything. The words shattered the illusion of silence Rendrick had tried to create. His eyes darted toward the curtain in irritation, his grip on control loosening like a rope fraying under too much pressure. That moment of distraction was all Marcel needed. With a pivot as smooth as it was deliberate, he moved to the nearest intercom panel beside the galley entrance. Rendrick lunged forward, hand outstretched to block him, but Marcel was faster. He slammed his elbow into the call button and leaned close to the speaker. Cockpit, this is passenger 1A, he said, voice measured and firm. A crew member just assaulted my child. The words were calm, but they rang like an alarm bell through the cabin. There was a brief, charged pause. Then the reply came, laced with tension. Copy that, 1A. This is flight deck. Stand by. The voice was unmistakably the captain's. Rendrick froze in place. For a second, he didn't breathe. His face twitched, jaw tightening, not in confusion, but in the realization that the narrative he had carefully laid out had just been ripped away from him. The moment the cockpit confirmed receipt of Marcel's message, the chain of command shifted. Rendrick was no longer the steward of the story. The captain was coming, and Rendrick's actions would now be subject to oversight, visible, reviewable, accountable. Karen stepped back against the bulkhead, breathing like a man who had been holding something in for too long. His chest heaved, eyes wide, face pale. He looked down, away from Marcel, away from Rendrick, as if ashamed to witness what was unfolding. The passengers behind the curtain grew louder. More phones appeared. Even those previously indifferent were now standing, peering between the curtain folds, watching the scene unfold as if it were courtroom drama stitched into the sky. What had once been isolated was now undeniable. Rendrick had lost the shadows, and he knew it. The intercom crackled again, this time with authority. Captain Vale is en route to the cabin. Marcel kept one arm wrapped tightly around Lien, who was now whimpering with soft confusion, and used the other to brace himself against the panel. He didn't relax, not for a second. Rendrick, though motionless, was a coil waiting to snap again. Marcel's mind was already 10 steps ahead, mapping exits, calculating reactions, anticipating the next lie that would be told. Rendrick turned toward Karen, his voice low but filled with fury. "You ruined the timing." Karen didn't answer. The footsteps came quickly, heavy, deliberate, echoing just beyond the forward curtain. And for the first time, Rendrick looked genuinely worried. The first crack appeared in a plan that was supposed to be perfect. The cockpit door burst open with a sharp pneumatic hiss, slicing through the tension like a blade. Captain Theron Vale stepped into the cabin, his boots hitting the floor with a weight that silenced even the murmuring passengers. He was broad-shouldered, mid-40s, and moved with the calm precision of a man who had weathered storms far worse than turbulence. His eyes locked first onto the crying infant in Marcel's arms, then darted to Rendrick, who stood just inches from the service door latch with a rigid spine and an unreadable glare. Theron's expression shifted immediately, stoic to steel. "What's happening here?" he asked, his voice low, commanding. Rendrick reacted fast, too fast. "He attacked me while I was ensuring cabin safety," he said, stabbing a finger in Marcel's direction. "He mishandled the child." But Captain Vale didn't look at Marcel. He turned toward the narrow break in the curtain where multiple phones were raised, their lenses unblinking, their owners deadly quiet. The captain's jaw clenched subtly. He had already seen a short burst of footage sent to the purser station the moment Marcel had activated the crew call system. He didn't need a story. He had a glimpse of the truth. Karen Dale, still pale and shaking, stood stiffly at the edge of the galley. His eyes flicked between Rendrick and the captain like a man standing between two tides. His lips parted, voice barely audible. "Captain." He grabbed the infant first. Rendrick turned on him. "Karen, don't you start," he hissed, venom slipping into his tone. Theron raised a firm hand, silencing both. "Step back," he said without raising his voice. But the weight of command was unmistakable. Rendrick's jaw tightened, his posture stiffened, but he obeyed. Marcel didn't speak at first. He watched the captain intently, not just for what he said but how he moved, measured, sharp-eyed, aware of every angle. Marcel's mind catalogued the details instinctively. Position of the galley tools, the exit latch's proximity, and most of all, Rendrick's subtle tics, shoulder twitch, clenching jaw, shifting weight. Then something clicked. Theron Vale. Hendrik Vale. The name struck him like a loose bolt snapping into place. A shared last name, this wasn't coincidence. Brothers? Cousins? A deeper tension laced every glance between them. Not just conflict, strain, history. The air pulsed with a quiet question. How far did this go? Karen swallowed audibly and leaned closer to Marcel as the captain moved forward. "They didn't tell him the full plan," he whispered, the confession so soft it was almost afraid of itself. Marcel processed the words like evidence. Someone had kept the captain out of the loop. Someone had underestimated the chain of command. The implication chilled him, not because it was unexpected, but because it confirmed what he had begun to suspect. This operation wasn't just sanctioned by rogue attendants. It was layered, hidden, fragmented, intentional. Theron's eyes finally met Marcel's. They didn't waver. Marcel adjusted Lien's blanket with one hand and used the other to pull his briefcase closer beneath the seat, sliding the corner of the sealed data tablet just into view. He did it subtly, but Theron noticed. His brow twitched. Recognition. The captain didn't say anything about the tablet. Instead, he stepped beside Marcel and spoke in a low voice meant only for him. Keep your child close. It wasn't just instruction. It was alignment, quiet but real. The first ally had revealed himself not with grand gestures, but with restraint, clarity, and timing. And that meant one thing. Marcel wasn't alone anymore. Two truths now hung in the air, one spoken, and one still waiting its moment. Captain Theron's voice cut through the tension like a blade. Step away from the galley, Rendrick. Rendrick didn't move. His stance was too stiff, too rehearsed. Marcel immediately shifted his weight, standing just behind the captain but slightly off-center, enough to shield Lien with his body while maintaining a clear line of sight to the attendant's hands. The moment wasn't loud, but the silence made it louder. Every eye in the cabin seemed fixed on the small space between the galley carts and the confrontation at hand. I said, Theron repeated, voice lower now but heavier. Step back. Rendrick's gaze darted toward Karen Dale, the second flight attendant who stood frozen beside the service counter, hands trembling at his sides. Karen's jaw clenched. A bead of sweat trailed from his temple down to the collar of his uniform, soaking into the pressed blue fabric. His lips parted once, then closed again. A man caught between orders and conscience. Marcel's eyes tracked everything. Rendrick's foot had subtly edged toward the lower galley drawer, the one most attendants used for utility tools, including the serving knives. It wasn't just his paranoia talking. The angle of Rendrick's knee, the subtle crouch in his posture, even the sharp twitch in his fingers, it all spelled preparation. Captain Theron remained still, observing both attendants. His pilot's instincts told him things had gone far beyond protocol. This wasn't a dispute, it was a test of control. The purser station behind him chimed loudly, piercing the tension. A voice crackled from the console. Flight 622? Ground oversight requests immediate clarification regarding cockpit signal received during in-flight conflict. Please confirm crew status and forward accountability report. The sound shook Karen. He flinched and turned pale, as if the distant voice had snapped a thread inside him. Marcel noticed his posture shift. His knees bent slightly, like someone bracing for collapse. You gonna speak, Karen? Rendrick asked quietly, teeth clenched, eyes narrow. Karen didn't answer. But then, with a breath that sounded more like a gasp for courage, Karen said, Tell him, Rendrick. Tell him what they wanted us to do. Rendrick's expression twisted. Fury, fear, and disbelief tangled across his face like a storm breaking over calm seas. You don't understand the consequences, he hissed, his voice low but edged with desperation. You think this ends here? Karen looked down, unable to meet anyone's gaze. His fingers dug into his palm. Then, in a motion as quiet as it was devastating, he stepped to the side, revealing his crew-issued device buzzing with a blinking message notification. Marcel leaned slightly to see it. He didn't need to read every word. The subject line alone struck like a lightning bolt. Confirm separation. Priority passenger flagged. Not a flight procedure. Not airline protocol. Private directive. Marcel's heart pounded, but his breathing remained slow. Someone outside the aircraft had issued that order. Someone with the intent to separate Lien from him mid-flight. Theron's head snapped toward the screen. That message came from HQ? He asked. Karen shook his head. It's not from Moralisair. It's encrypted. Came through a third-party clearance tunnel I didn't even know we had until today. The captain narrowed his eyes. Let me see it. In a flash of instinct, Rendrick lunged. He didn't yell or warn. He moved with sudden aggression, trying to seize the crew device before the captain could reach it. But Marcel was faster. Even with Lien tucked securely against his chest, he stepped into Rendrick's path, angling his forearm across the man's shoulder with a sharp pivot. The force was just enough to unbalance him. Rendrick staggered sideways, slammed against the corner of the service panel, and fell to one knee. The crew device clattered to the floor and slid under a seat near the aisle. Passengers gasped. The curtain between VIP and main cabin fluttered as more heads peeked through. Phones were already filming. The world beyond the aircraft now had front-row seats to everything unfolding. Rendrick growled as he stood, glaring at both men. His nostrils flared, chest rising and falling like a man pushed into a corner. But even now, Marcel could tell this wasn't panic. It was a controlled burn. He was stalling, still playing from a deeper script. Captain Theron, unmoved, took a step forward and spoke with the quiet gravity of a man who had once issued battlefield orders. "Rendrick, you're done." But Rendrick smiled faintly, shaking his head. "You have no idea how wrong that is." Marcel kept one hand on Lien, the other hovering just behind his briefcase near the wall. His thoughts raced not just about protecting his son, but about that message. Someone had flagged Lien. Lien, not him. That made no sense. Unless... Karen's lips moved again, barely a whisper now. "Please, just end this." The truth was crawling out, line by line, faster than Rendrick could bury it. The attendant smirked, confident the child was powerless, unaware that every second had been anticipated and the father's training and strength were about to turn the tables instantly. If you believe cruelty under authority always folds when courage and skill intervene, hit subscribe now, because justice never hesitates. "Hey, we saw him grab the baby first." A man's voice rang out from row 2, his arm thrust high, phone recording, shaking with indignation. Another voice followed, equally firm. "It's all on camera." The first-class cabin, once veiled in awkward silence and drawn curtains, had erupted into a theater of truth. Witnesses, until now unsure whether to intervene, rose from their plush seats like a jury finding its voice. The balance of power shifted in an instant, and Rendrick Vale knew it. He lunged, not toward Marcel or the child this time, but toward the crew device that had skidded across the cabin floor just seconds earlier. His stride was urgent, desperate, the calculated poise of earlier now replaced with raw instinct. But Marcel Veron, with his 10-month-old son Lien clutched securely in one arm, saw the trajectory coming. His foot slid out deliberately, intercepting the device with practiced precision. It disappeared beneath the seat behind him, safe, for now. Captain Theron Vale stepped forward like a drawn blade. "Stand down," he said sharply, each syllable sharp with command. His voice didn't rise, but it carried decades of discipline behind it, and Rendrick flinched as if struck. There was something more than protocol in that tone, something born in fire, not policy. Yet Rendrick was far from finished. His chest heaved. Sweat had formed at his temples. "He's carrying restricted tech," he barked, jabbing a finger toward the dark case beneath Marcel's seat. "You need to check that tablet. That's why this is happening." A ripple of stillness spread. Every passenger heard it. Every word hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Marcel's eyes didn't widen, but the calculation behind them intensified. That was a detail Rendrick should not have known. That tablet, containing integration protocols for Veroni's Dynamics' new ethical response AI, was locked, encrypted, and scheduled for a private handoff to the Velmora Consortium. Only a handful of people had access to that information. Marcel straightened slowly, gently shifting Lien's weight in his arm to calm the child. "How do you know what I'm carrying?" he asked, voice low, nearly conversational. But beneath it was steel. Rendrick's mouth opened, then closed. That slip had cost him. Near the galley wall, Karen Dale dropped into a jump seat, his face pale, hands trembling. He stared at the floor as though the guilt had finally clawed its way to the surface. "They said no one would get hurt," he whispered, not to anyone in particular, but loud enough for truth to spill into the cabin. Captain Theron turned toward the crew device still nestled behind Marcel. He stepped around them both, retrieved it, and tapped the display. A soft chime, a pause. Then his eyes hardened. "This isn't an airline command," he said. turning the screen for Rendrick to see. And that was the moment Rendrick truly froze. Whatever composure he had constructed, whatever bravado he had held onto, it evaporated. His body locked, eyes twitching toward the sealed curtain. His mind raced. Marcel took a measured step forward, not aggressive, but unshakable. "Who sent it?" he asked again, quieter this time. Lien stirred gently in his arms but did not cry. Before the question could be answered, the plane jolted with sudden violence. The cabin lights flickered. Luggage compartments creaked. Several passengers shouted in alarm. Some clutched the seats. The aircraft dipped for a beat, then recovered. Silence. All eyes swept to the windows. No lightning. No storm. The cockpit didn't immediately explain the turbulence. And yet, Marcel could see it clear as day in the way Rendrick stood, braced, as if expecting that exact moment. The turbulence wasn't nature's whim. It was a signal. Across the cabin, Karen's hands covered his face. He spoke again, voice cracking under the weight of realization. They said the father would just hand over the infant if pressured. And now, the entire cabin knew. This wasn't a miscommunication. It was an operation. Captain Theron's face darkened further. "External command, private authorization," he muttered almost to himself. He looked up slowly. "Rendrick, you're done." But Rendrick only smiled. It was small, cruel, knowing. "We're not done yet," he whispered. The storm outside had nothing on the one inside the galley. Rendrick Vale lunged toward the galley carts with a suddenness that felt practiced. Marcel's instincts flared like a detonated alarm. Without hesitation, he passed his son into the arms of the older passenger seated just across the aisle, an ex-military man who had nodded at him earlier with quiet respect. "Hold him steady," Marcel said, already on his feet before the words finished leaving his mouth. The man received Lien with a firm but gentle grip. Lien wailed at the change, but Marcel had no choice. The threat had moved beyond suspicion. Rendrick was reaching for something, and if Marcel didn't stop him now, whatever was coming next wouldn't be words. With fluid, almost surgical motion, Marcel intercepted Rendrick mid-lunge. He pivoted his left shoulder and struck forward, his body compacting years of defense training into a single, measured movement. Rendrick's body slammed into the galley wall with a heavy, metallic thud. A box of service trays rattled violently beside them. Marcel pinned Rendrick's wrist against the compartment with just enough pressure to immobilize without breaking bone. Yet, the force of the maneuver was controlled but not gentle. "Stay down," Marcel hissed. Gasps rippled across the first-class cabin. Passengers began to rise, recording everything. The sound of camera shutters clicking mixed with muffled shouts. Every phone in the cabin turned toward the galley like courtroom evidence being gathered in real time. Rendrick grimaced but didn't resist. He had expected panic. He had expected surrender. He had not expected precision. He chuckled bitterly, his voice low. "You're better trained than the brief said." Marcel's eyes narrowed. That one sentence gave too much away. "You read a brief about me?" Captain Theron Vale appeared at the galley threshold, gripping a pair of restraints from the emergency kit. His expression was stone. "Back away, Dr. Veron. I've got this." Marcel released Rendrick's arm, but not his stare. He backed up one step, retrieving Lien from the older man, who returned the baby with a nod and no questions. Lien clung to his father's collar, still crying. His tiny fists curled against Marcel's chest. Rendrick twisted in Theron's grip as the restraints clicked around his wrists. "This is a mistake," he growled. "None of you understand the level above this." Theron leaned in. "Try me." Karen Dale, pale and shaking, stood a few feet away, shoulders sagging. He looked like a man caught between two collapsing walls. "I'll testify," he said, the words trembling from his mouth. He wasn't acting alone. I didn't know how far it would go. Theron's head turned sharply. "Who else is involved?" Karen's voice cracked. It wasn't from Aurelise. The message, he got it externally. Someone with ties to a private group. Marcel stepped forward slowly. Let me see the sender ID. Theron raised the crew device, already accessing the flagged message. His eyes flicked across the display, lips tightening. The contractor isn't listed in our network, he muttered. But the packet has a trace signature. They're linked to a private security firm, one I've seen before. Marcel's chest tightened. Which firm? Theron turned the device so Marcel could see. At the edge of the transmission code was a faint, encoded symbol. A triangle fractured down the middle. The moment Marcel saw it, a wave of bitter recognition ran through him. The Laronis Directive, a name he hadn't heard in nearly 6 years. Dissolved, blacklisted, and disbanded, or so everyone thought. They had once specialized in tactical extractions under the cover of civilian protocols. But they'd vanished after being implicated in multiple international ethics violations. Yet here they were, threading themselves back into reality with quiet violence. Marcel exhaled slowly, the picture crystallizing. They weren't after the data, he said, his voice low and certain. They thought Lien was the key. Karen looked up, face ashen. They said you'd give him up if we said it was for safety. They never said it would get physical. They said it was just pressure. Rendrick twisted in his restraints, eyes blazing with defiance. You think you stopped something, he sneered. But you're only at the edge. Marcel ignored him. His focus shifted to Theron. We need to notify the cockpit. If this was coordinated, they might have ground support waiting. Theron nodded grimly, pulling his radio from his belt and stepping toward the intercom. Marcel returned to his seat, tightening the harness over Lien's small frame. He placed the baby's ear against his chest, murmuring softly. The boy's cries faded into shallow hiccups. The intercom crackled. Theron's voice filtered into the cabin. All crew, this is the captain. Prepare for potential protocol breach. We are escalating to security condition amber. The aircraft rumbled slightly. The hum of the engines remained unchanged. But Marcel noticed something in Rendrick's face. A flicker of satisfaction. The man smiled, even in restraints. You're too late, he said quietly. The moment the wheels touch down, everything changes. Passengers stared in silence, the cabin air thick with dread and unspoken questions. Karen slumped against the bulkhead, whispering to no one in particular. We were never supposed to get this far. Marcel placed a protective hand over his son's back, eyes locked on the galley, thoughts already racing ahead. The real architect of the plan was still waiting in the shadows. Captain Theron lunged for the emergency compartment, his hand moving with trained precision as he pulled free a set of restraints. Rendrick Vale thrashed in place, his breath sharp and erratic, every movement steeped in panic and something more dangerous, intent. Marcel didn't wait. With Lien still safely nestled in the arms of the older passenger a few rows behind him, he positioned himself between Rendrick and the galley wall, body squared, feet planted. He didn't blink. He didn't breathe more than necessary. Every nerve in him was ready to counter. Rendrick's wrists snapped forward again, almost colliding with the edge of the jump seat as he barked out incoherent denials. But there was venom in his voice now, not fear. Theron stepped behind him and grabbed his elbow, forcing his arm down, locking it. Stay still, the captain ordered with a tone that had once commanded officers on foreign runways, not just flight attendants in a pressurized cabin. Rendrick didn't obey. He snarled, twisting his shoulders, trying to buck forward. Marcel flanked the other side, gripping Rendrick's opposite forearm, not to punish, but to stop. He's trying to reach the drawer, Marcel said, nodding toward the galley where a steel handle glinted, kitchen shears or a tool bag stowed just out of reach. Theron understood immediately. They worked in tandem, pressing Rendrick against the sidewall, neutralizing his momentum without causing visible harm. From the aisle, Karen watched with ghost-white skin and quaking fingers. His eyes darted from Marcel to Theron to the restrained figure now buckling under the weight of his own failure. This wasn't supposed to go this far, Karen whispered, his voice a cracked string. They said he would panic and hand the child over. Marcel didn't even turn. Who is they? Karen froze, his lips parted, then sealed again. His hand gripped the nearest seat back for balance, as if the truth alone might knock him over. His silence wasn't ignorance, it was fear. Not of Rendrick, but of whoever operated above him. Rendrick broke the tension with a cold, bitter laugh that echoed far too loudly for the cramped cabin. It wasn't mirth, it was a performance. A message meant to rattle everyone watching. "You really think it ends with me, Captain?" he said, voice rasped from strain. His chin lifted in defiance. "You think this was personal? You're playing checkers on a chessboard. All of you." Theron didn't respond with words. He pulled Rendrick's left arm across the restraint bar, securing the first cuff. But as he did, Marcel's sharp eyes caught something unusual. The cuff of Rendrick's uniform sleeve rode up, revealing a thin, metallic patch near the wrist. Barely larger than a coin, it shimmered against the fabric, its emblem faint but unmistakable. A triangle with a broken line running through its center. It looked innocuous. To anyone else, meaningless. But not to Marcel. He exhaled slowly, recognition sinking in like cold water through his spine. The Laroni's directive. It had to be. That mark had been scrubbed from databases years ago, after the group was supposedly disbanded. A private security force built on covert extraction contracts, misdirection, and high-value retrievals under the guise of legal loopholes. Ruthless, erased from record. Yet here it was, stitched onto the sleeve of a flight attendant now shackled to a jump seat. Karen's eyes tracked Marcel's stare. When he followed it and saw the patch, something inside him cracked. "You weren't the only one they flagged," Karen said quietly, as though the words themselves might draw attention. His hands trembled harder now, like a man realizing he had been a chess piece moved by hands he never saw. Dramatic irony closed in around them like a narrowing corridor. Marcel had boarded Oralisair Flight 622 believing his sole task was to deliver the sealed security AI tablet to the Velmora Consortium. Now he stood at the center of something darker. His child had become a target not by chance, but by design. The mission wasn't about stopping him. It was about separating him, weakening him, removing leverage. Captain Theron clicked the second cuff into place and stood upright, silent. Rendrick didn't resist anymore, but that smile remained. It wasn't cocky. It was confident, knowing. A grin that promised more than defiance. It promised legacy. "They'll be waiting when we land," he hissed. Not shouting but projecting every syllable so the nearest passengers could hear. Gasps rippled down the rows. Even Karen stepped back, swallowing air like a man near drowning. Marcel stood still, not blinking. He understood the warning for what it was. Not a bluff, not a trick, but a fact. This wasn't the climax of the storm. It was the eye of it. There was more to come, more waiting beyond the tarmac. Beyond the door. Beyond the false calm of landing gear and airport terminals. He moved to reclaim Lien from the older passenger. The child's small face still nestled in sleep, despite the echoes of chaos. As Marcel secured the infant back to his chest harness, he didn't speak. He didn't argue. He simply looked back at Rendrick one last time, then at the captain, then forward again toward the sealed cabin door. He adjusted Lien's blanket and whispered low enough for only his son to hear, though the weight of it reached further than the words. A storm was waiting on the runway long before the plane ever left it. Captain Theron Vale's voice was tight with urgency as he barked into the cockpit intercom. "Priority landing. Nearest major airport. Alert ground control, this flight's compromised." The pilot confirmed, and within seconds, the aircraft's trajectory subtly shifted downward, angling into an early descent. The fasten seatbelt signs blinked to life, accompanied by the customary chime. But this time it didn't reassure. It ignited waves of unease. Nervous murmurs rippled through the cabin like rising wind through grass. Something was happening. The tension was no longer an undercurrent. It was thick, pressing, real. Marcel didn't wait. He crossed the narrow aisle swiftly and reclaimed Lien from the elderly man who had cradled him with surprising care. The baby's cheeks were flushed from crying, but the moment Marcel pressed him gently against his chest and whispered his name, Lien's cries softened into hiccuping breaths. Marcel rocked him slightly, keeping his own heartbeat calm, steady, because Lien's depended on it. His voice remained low, soothing. His eyes, however, never stopped scanning the cabin, calculating the next step. Karen approached slowly, his uniform askew, face pale, hands clasped tightly in front of him like a student caught in a lie. "I'll give a full statement," he said, barely above a whisper. His gaze never met Marcel's. "I didn't know they wanted to take the child. They told us it was a precaution, that the father carried unstable tech and that separation was mandatory." Marcel looked him over carefully. "No aggression. Just wait." He saw it then. Karen wasn't complicit. He was caught. A cog in a machine built to rotate without questioning where it rolled. "They manipulated you," Marcel said calmly, voice even, "like they tried to manipulate this flight." Theron moved beside them, hands on his hips, posture rigid as he absorbed Karen's confession. The captain's eyes flicked to Marcel, then to the infant still strapped securely against his chest. "They wanted to isolate you," he said, the words more confirmation than theory, "and make it look procedural." Marcel nodded slowly. The logic was now crystalline. "The turbulence," he said, "wasn't natural. It was a trigger, a coded signal to initiate what Rendrick called separation." Captain Theron inhaled through his nose, his jaw flexing once. "They used airline protocols to stage an extraction," he muttered. "Weaponized procedure." In the jump seat, wrists bound, Rendrick gave a quiet laugh. His face, though bruised and scraped, still carried that unrepentant smugness. "You're too late," he muttered, his voice low and bitter, aimed like a dart at Marcel. "The moment the wheels touch down, everything changes." The threat wasn't subtle. It didn't need to be. The real question hung unspoken. Who would be waiting on the other side of the runway? Marcel adjusted the infant harness, strapping Lien closer to his chest. The small boy now half asleep again, resting into the rhythm of his father's breathing. His mind raced through contingencies, visualizing every possible layout of the landing zone, every route from the tarmac to the terminal, every blind spot that could harbor a waiting threat. The data tablet, still secure in its steel casing beneath the seat, wasn't the only prize anymore. They wanted Lien, and that meant this wasn't business. It was personal. He stepped closer to Theron and lowered his voice. "There's something you should know," he said. "The tablet I'm carrying has a secure trace device built into its internal housing. I activated it 10 minutes ago using a biometric override." He paused. "If it worked, my security division is already tracking this plane's descent." Theron blinked, then his lips tightened into something like hope. "So you're not the only one preparing a welcome party?" "No," Marcel said, "but I'm willing to bet theirs arrives first." A long silence stretched between them. Karen, still shaken, slumped into an empty jump seat and buried his face in his hands. The cost of following orders without question was finally landing around him. Rendrick, by contrast, leaned forward in his restraints as far as they would allow, his eyes gleaming with something far colder than satisfaction. It was belief in a cause Marcel couldn't yet see. The cabin dipped slightly again as the landing gear locked into place with a heavy, audible thunk beneath the floor. From the overhead speakers, the pilot's voice came in firm and steady. "Due to a developing security situation, we will be remaining on the tarmac. Passengers must stay seated. Do not attempt to disembark." Marcel turned toward the nearest window and narrowed his eyes. There, tucked beside a perimeter access gate, 2 black vans had already pulled up, sleek and unmarked. Too close, too early, too familiar. He said nothing, just tightened his arm across Lien's back. Theron spotted the vans too. "Unmarked. That's not airport security," he said. "They're here," Rendrick whispered, smiling again like a man whose final move had already been played. But outside the opposite end of the tarmac, another flicker of movement caught Marcel's eye. 3 more vehicles were now racing in, dark, boxy SUVs, bearing the unmistakable Veronese insignia across the hoods. Marcel exhaled. Reinforcements. His reinforcements. The moment their boots hit the ground, the battlefield reshaped itself. The plane hit the tarmac with a jolt that knocked several overhead compartments ajar. Seatbelts snapped tight across chests as passengers instinctively braced. Captain Theron Vale's voice followed almost immediately, calm but layered with steel. Remain seated. Ground security has been alerted. We are not cleared to open doors at this time. His words landed like a locked gate, measured, final. Marcel Veron didn't flinch. His arms tightened protectively around Lien, who stirred and let out a soft whimper against his chest. Through the oval window beside him, Marcel saw them, two matte black vans positioned far too close to the restricted access point of the runway. No airline logos. No standard airport markings, just silent metal and intent. They're here, Rendrick Vale whispered from his jump seat restraints, a crooked smile blooming across his face like a scar reopening. The calm in his voice wasn't relief, it was anticipation. Marcel's jaw tightened, and his eyes moved fast, assessing the layout of the cabin, the visible exits, the crew positions. Karen Dale, still standing a few feet from the galley, went pale as he followed Marcel's gaze out the window. He staggered a half-step back, hand gripping the jump seat behind him. I didn't know they'd actually show up, he muttered, as if realizing too late how far this had spiraled. Outside, the van doors slid open with mechanical precision. 5 men emerged, each dressed in identical covert jackets marked subtly with the broken line triangle insignia. It was the same symbol Marcel had seen on Rendrick's sleeve. The Laronis directive. Captain Theron locked the cockpit behind him and initiated the cabin seal protocol. The lights shifted slightly, dimming as interior systems rerouted power into reinforced lock mechanisms. In the aisle, flight attendants stood frozen, uncertain whether to follow their standard emergency training or await direct orders. None had ever drilled for this. Marcel's mind moved faster than panic. These men were not here for negotiation. They were recovery specialists trained not just to retrieve, but to disappear their targets. And Rendrick's earlier words now rang with grim clarity. They're not here for the tablet, Rendrick said again, leaning forward as far as the restraints would allow. His voice was low, almost reverent. They're here for the infant. The words cracked through the cabin like a lightning strike. The tablet was bait. The true objective was far more personal. Marcel's eyes widened, not in fear, but in confirmation. Someone believed Lien was the key to something far beyond data. A second later, movement on the far side of the runway caught Marcel's eye. 3 vehicles, sleek, fast, and bearing the bold insignia of Veroni's Dynamics, swerved onto the tarmac from a secured access route. Floodlights washed over the wing. Their arrival was not subtle. They weren't trying to sneak in, they were claiming ground. From the black vans, the operatives hesitated. Their formation faltered for the first time. The Veroni's vehicles stopped about 40 yards away, doors opening in synchronized motion. 6 men stepped out, each outfitted in tactical suits woven with biometric mesh. Marcel recognized them instantly, Tier 2 response units from his own private security division. He had activated the emergency trace signal embedded in the tablet 28 minutes earlier. Reinforcements had come. Inside the aircraft, tension became atmosphere. Passengers stared out of windows, mouths agape. Phones were held up, but hands were shaking. The battle forming outside was silent, but it screamed consequences. Karen stepped toward Marcel, voice nearly lost beneath the roar of engines and rushing adrenaline. I swear, they told us it was just to separate you. They didn't say anything about the child being a target. His voice cracked on the last word. Guilt painted his face like ash. Captain Theron stood between the cockpit and the galley, his eyes locked on the men outside. His voice was clipped and authoritative. We hold the cabin. No doors open. No transfers. I don't care what badge they flash. Marcel nodded silently. He reached up and pressed Lien closer to his chest. The child stirred, eyes fluttering open. Marcel kissed his forehead once, whispering with iron resolve, You're safe. I'm here. Across the cabin, Rendrick's expression faltered. The confidence drained from his face, replaced by something far more human. doubt. The aircraft remained sealed, steel doors holding the line as two forces faced off under the fading afternoon sun. One came cloaked in secrecy, the other in purpose. And for the first time, Marcel felt the weight shifting back into his favor. The moment their boots hit the ground, the battlefield reshaped itself. Airport command vehicles swarmed the tarmac within minutes. Red and amber lights flashed against the metal belly of the aircraft as ground security teams rushed to form a perimeter around both sets of vehicles, the unmarked black vans and the incoming Veronese escorts. The air between them shimmered with heat from the engine exhaust, but the real burn came from the standoff unfolding in silence. On board, tension was no longer invisible. It was alive in every breath, every movement, every drawn curtain and widened eye. Captain Theron Vale stepped off the aircraft first, his crisp uniform now dusted with sweat as he coordinated with the arriving command officers. His voice, low and steady, guided the unfolding containment. No one in or out without clearance. Behind him, in the cabin doorway, Dr. Marcel Veron stood tall, Lien secured against his chest with the infant harness, both arms braced around his son as if his spine alone held the storm at bay. His eyes didn't waver. They stayed locked on the vans outside. Rendrick Vale, bound tightly at the wrists with emergency restraints, was slouched in a jump seat across the galley. His head lolled slightly, but that smirk still lingered like a poison that refused to dissipate. He chuckled once under his breath, a dry, unsettling sound that earned him nothing but silence from the passengers who had witnessed it all. "You're going to want to see this," Karen Dale muttered as he stepped forward, holding out his crew device. His face was pale but firm, no longer the trembling man from earlier. "I'm cooperating fully." Officers stepped aboard, their vests marked with airport command clearance. One took Karen's device. Another moved to escort Rendrick off the plane. Marcel shifted to the side, never letting Rendrick out of his line of sight. Lien stirred slightly, but Marcel's hand on his back kept him calm. Every motion was calculated. Every step forward was done with the weight of truth carried behind it. The officer who had taken Karen's device tapped through several messages, his expression hardening with each new screen. Encrypted transfers, offshore accounts, real-time directives, he muttered. This wasn't improvised. This was executed with precision. The climax struck when the command unit traced the highest priority message's origin. One officer approached Theron with urgency, whispering something that made the captain's face freeze, then pale. Theron slowly turned toward Marcel, his voice soft but hollow. The signal was traced to someone named Dr. Soren Vale. Marcel blinked once. He hadn't expected that name, but he remembered it clearly. Soren Vale, a former research partner within the consortium. Removed years ago for ethical breaches so severe they were nearly classified. That connection stung with dramatic irony. Theron's last name wasn't a coincidence. The man who had helped protect his son was now staring down the weight of a brother's betrayal. Theron exhaled as if the news pulled a breath straight from his ribs. He never stopped. He just went underground. The officers didn't need more. Rendrick was dragged down the aisle, wrists restrained, still wearing that half-smile until he passed Marcel. But this time he didn't say a word. Marcel's silence was heavier than any reply. The man who had tried to rip Lien from his arms now looked away. Karen stood just beyond the curtain, answering questions as officers guided him into protective review. "They told us the infant had to be separated for bio-screening," he said, his voice cracking. "They didn't tell us why. I didn't know it was about the child's DNA. I didn't know they thought he was a key." That phrase echoed. A genetic key. Marcel's mind raced, but he showed no fear. The directive had assumed too much. Lien wasn't a key to anything, at least not intentionally. The data tablet he carried held the ethical AI model, not biometrics. But it was enough of a misreading to spark this chaos. And that misreading could have cost him his son. Within the hour, officers completed the sweep. Soren Vale's covert channel had been exposed. Rendrick and his collaborators were charged on site. Karen's cooperation earned him temporary protection. Meanwhile, Marcel's delivery of the tablet to the Velmora consortium went forward without delay. its integrity verified, its contents already being prepared for review. But it wasn't the data that changed policy. It was the incident. What happened on Flight 622 triggered immediate reviews across the aviation industry. Protocols for crew conduct, private security infiltration, and mid-air incident response were overhauled within weeks. Many of the new measures drawn directly from Captain Theron's cabin report and Marcel's testimony. No longer would passenger surveillance be left unchecked. No longer would emergency alerts be ignored as passenger disturbances. The sky, once seen as sovereign, had been breached, and now it was fortified. As dawn broke, casting soft gold over the runway, Marcel stepped off the aircraft with Lien cradled gently against him. The baby's head rested on his chest, breath warm and calm. A technician passed with equipment. Reporters waited behind a distant barrier. But Marcel ignored it all. He paused at the top of the stairs. One breath. Then he whispered into Lien's ear with the quiet strength of a father who had endured the unimaginable. "You were never in danger, not while I'm here." The sky finally cleared after a storm that tried to hide itself in silence. The father lifted his baby off the floor and slammed him into the galley wall, neutralizing the threat and leaving the crew stunned. If you believe real authority acts decisively to protect the innocent, subscribe now, because justice always lands first. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It highlights abuse of authority, prejudice, and the power of composure and strategic action in confronting wrongdoing. Its purpose is to raise awareness, inspire empathy, and encourage conversations about equality, accountability, and protecting every family with dignity and respect.